Hello again, my American Studies 140 students. This is Dr. Donald R. Collins again. This is the second half of the week 6 recording for my summer course or the week 14 course for my other courses in the fall and spring. And so this is in fact the final video recording for this course for this summer session / this semester, depending on where we are in things. So at this point you're finishing up your final reflection for the course or the final touches of the presentation you're doing for this course. So that's what you're doing right now. But be that as it may, wherever you are, this is the final piece. And the final piece really deals with a continuation of the discussion around not just LGBT rights and the LGBT community in DC, but protest culture in DC as a whole. As exemplified by the 2017 Women's March and where things are going, right? And it's really about sort of telling us where we are as a country and where DC is as a city and the DMV is as a metropolitan area, as a cosmopolitan area, in the here and now. And the here and now is something along the lines of this. And over the last, say, anywhere between 30 and 50 years, it's fairly obvious that DC has become much more of a site for run-of-the-mill everyday protests, right? And when I say that, that's not to disparage anybody's issue, regardless of what it is. If you're doing a March for Life, if you're doing an anti-Trump rally, if you're doing an environmental rally for the stem tide of climate change, if you are protesting in front of the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court is rolling back provisions to protect voting rights, women's rights, social justice kinds of issues, or if you're more on the social injustice, more conservative side, I guess, if you will, and you're trying to actually get rid of Roe v. Wade, and you don't want to protect the rights of undocumented immigrants, what the right tends to call illegals or whatnot. The fact of the matter is that this city is a place, has become a repository toward constant protest, which seem on the whole to be less effective at moving the federal government, or in the case of things that are DC specific, the DC government toward actual change, even when many people get together. Anti-war protests, from the anti-war protests in Vietnam, which tended to be more effective, to anti-war protests against the first Gulf War, against the war in Iraq, against the continuation of American troops going to Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria and Niger and Somalia and other places over the years, right? So there's all of that mixed in here. And what I'm trying to say to you is that are these protests really effective anymore? Are they really getting to move the officialdom of DC, Congress, Capitol Hill, the Senate, the House, the presidency, whoever's in charge, whether it's a Democratic administration or a Republican administration, to do what the populace really wants it to do as a whole? That's the question to think about. And it's really encapsulated in the 2017 Women's March, this all-encompassing march with women from pretty much every possible background. Mostly white, though, but from every possible background, gathering in Washington, D.C. as part of a multitude of something like 5 or 6 million people, mostly women, the day after President Donald Trump's inauguration, protesting his election, protesting the election process, protesting his administration, but mostly protesting the misogyny and the sexism that women are subjected to every day in a patriarchal society like the one in which we have. And that was really what that was all about. And the fact that even though that many women got together, even though that helped set off other things like the Me Too movement and the host of other issues around equal pay for equal work, around reproductive rights, around women's equality in general, there were enough schisms within the Women's March of 2017, and enough ignorance, really, or ignoring, really, of larger issues that women face on a more everyday basis to ask the question, was it really that effective? Yes, Harvey Weinstein was arrested. Yes, Jeffrey Epstein was arrested and ended up killing himself, officially killing himself. We don't know what really happened, but officially killing himself after being arrested. Those things, Bill Cosby and so on, R. Kelly and so on, all being picked up for the misogyny, the raping, the child molestation and raping and other things other horrific things that these men have done. That's great. Individual victories are wonderful, but systemically, has anything really changed? Has Congress passed laws to protect women from domestic violence, to protect women from date rape, to protect women from protect women's reproductive rights, including the right to have an abortion, and certainly in cases of being raped and incest, which, by the way, are not rare instances, despite what despite what folks on whatever side of the aisle might be saying, the actual scientific evidence shows that this is more than an infrequent occurrence. So these aren't really exceptions. These should be normal things in a society that's not protecting women from rape or from incest, for that matter. So those are the kinds of things that were brought up during the march, which have not been addressed in any shape, or form. In practical level in terms of protections. And so that's sort of a continuation from what my previous video was about, which was about LGBT rights in DC and protest movements in DC on a national and local level around those rights. The same thing applies with regard to women in DC, and whether they be black women who face a lot of these kinds of issues, or they be white women or other women of color, or lesbian or queer or heterosexual or poor or rich or middle class. These issues apply. They apply differently. They apply unevenly. And that's sort of the theme. The theme here within that march is also about what was happening within that march, because within the march that was mostly white, right? Abortion's a big issue, but so is the fact that 53% of white women voted for Trump. So how do you have a women's march to protect the rights of women in the United States when the majority of white women who did vote for Trump actually voted for Trump? You could say it's 47% because it depends on what kind of statistical analysis you do for it. But still, that's still half. That's still literally half of the women who white women who voted for Trump. Whether it's 47 or 53%, split the difference, it's 50. So if you are a black woman, if you are a Latinx or Latina, or you are Asian or you're indigenous, you're looking at this and you're going, okay, why do we are part of a march for folks who will vote for patriarchy and racism more than we vote for women's rights and for anti-racism? So that's where that's the also internalized schism within social justice communities who come here to use DC as a platform to bring sight to, and bring and shine a light on the injustices that that particular group has faced within our society or around the world. And so again, the question really comes up that even as DC has become much more of a place where people frequently come to do the work of protest, is it an effective place to come and do the work of the protest? Is it the most relevant place to come and do the work of protest? And I'll take that a step further because of where we are at this point in this year, which is all the protests that have been happening this spring and now this summer over police killings, over police, murdering folks in the streets, putting knee to neck, and guns to people's backs, and bullets in people's bodies, and tear gas in people's and mace in people's eyes, and rubber bullets to blind journalists and arresting them for doing their jobs, and things of that nature, and on and on and on it goes. Between George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, and if we're going to go back further, Sandra Bland and excuse me, Mike Brown, if you go back to to my early years, to Michael Stewart and Eleanor Bumpers, to Amadou Diallo and so many other people that have been brutalized either at the hands of law enforcement or at the hands of vigilantes, most of whom would be white, deciding that they want to take the law in their own hands and going after folks, Trayvon Martin and so on. And so we've noticed in the last months that these uprisings, these protests, these demonstrations have not been centered in D.C. D.C.'s been a part of things, but it's not been centered in D.C. Minneapolis became a flashpoint, with actual full-fledged insurrection where they burned down a police precinct. Ferguson was a flashpoint where for months protesters faced off against militarized police, unarmed, unarmed, brave people facing off against police, losing their lives, activists mysteriously losing their lives. So again, I ask the question, how effective is it to run, to have protests, to have demonstrations, to do this work in Washington, D.C. as part of D.C.'s protest culture, when in point of fact, the main flashpoints for getting anything done, making even minor symbolic victories against Confederate statues, or having a DA removed from office, or police officers fired or tried, and in a couple of cases actually convicted for their crimes, those sorts of things. Is DC the place for that? Or is it really become such a place where it's normal to protest, so people are desensitized to the fact that people are protesting the nation's capital? And so instead, what you have are other parts of the country that become more prominent, with DC sort of either being on the sidelines or, excuse me, as a place where not tangential, but is adjacent, is like protest adjacent. You do the protest here because it is, in fact, the nation's capital, but it's not centered here. It's just a way to bring more attention or more light to an issue that's affecting people in Minneapolis, and in Ferguson, and in Los Angeles, and in New York, and in Shreveport, Louisiana, and in Duluth, Minnesota, and in Chicago, and so on, and so many other places across this country. So that's the question I want you to answer here. And that's the issue I want you to think about here with regard to this week. Where does that leave DC? Where it very much is a place where you can do protests, but it's also a place where it's obviously less effective. A Congress is less beholden to the average person, to the average American, and more beholden to moneyed interest in Wall Street, to billionaires who line their pockets, to the corporate world more generally, right? To K Street, and to a White House that is more imperial than probably ever before, and has become such over the last, say, 30 to 50 years, right? And it doesn't matter whether the president's Democratic or Republican. This is not an argument about left versus right or any other media trope you want to use. This is literally looking at the history of what's happened over the last 30 to 50 years in terms of the presidency, in terms of Congress, and it doesn't matter what party you support. That's the trajectory the government's been on, and that's documented through the worlds of political science, sociology, and history. So you want to pick an argument with me, pick an argument with me based on the evidence, not based on what your party affiliation or ideology is. So so let's put that aside. The real question is regardless of all of those sort of media tropes and perspectives, looking at this from a more objective and long frame angle, what does this mean in terms of where DC stands as a place to do protests, as a place to expect policy changes, a place on a local level to expect the DC government to continue to do the work to help support people in the midst of things like and gentrification and you know deal with issues around domestic violence, deal with issues around crime and policing and mass incarceration, and all these other issues that are national, but also have a particular effect on a community that is still 47% black, but also 40% white, but also 13%, of color, and 14% of immigrant culture. that is like 14, 15% LGBT. That where women, where transgender women are murdered at high rates, particularly black transgender women. What does that mean in terms of local protests as well? Is DC government more responsive because of the fact that they're in this fishbowl known as DC? And what about the DMV as a whole? How do you get Virginia and Maryland to also sort of be in lockstep with DC government around these issues of being more progressive on these, issues and flashpoints in terms of protesting, why people are protesting? How do those governments respond? Right. So that's where we are in terms of state of things, into the day, into the day, and state of things are today in the 2020s in Washington D.C. And so that's really what I want you guys to think through, think about, be ready to discuss.